The Department of Justice is investigating protesters who disrupted a church service over the weekend in Minnesota, where one of those pastors worked as an ICE agent. Joining me now to assess these developments is Tony Perkins, president of Family Research Council and former chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Tony, great to have you back on the program. So, under President Trump, we've seen a renewed focus on faith and on protecting Christians at home and abroad. How do you assess his actions so far, and what still needs to be done to defend people of faith around the world, and your assessment of what took place in Minnesota over the weekend?
Well, Steve, I think Minnesota is Exhibit A, that this administration has a much different view than the previous administration. The Justice Department, and this is where the president really is making a difference, is that he has placed men and women in positions that are working within the confines of the Constitution to protect religious freedom and the American way of life. Again, Minnesota being a prime example of this. Under the Biden administration, the FACE Act, Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, was used to go after pro-lifers. I mean, it was really stretched to go after those that were praying outside of abortion clinics. That law was passed in the mid-90s under Bill Clinton, and it was designed to go after the pro-life protesters outside of abortion clinics. But Orrin Hatch amended it, added something to it that provided the same provisions for those who disrupt worship services, which is what happened in Minnesota over the weekend. And the Department of Justice is now looking at using the FACE Act to bring charges against those who disrupted that service, something we've been advocating for quite some time. It's good to see that happening. And that's just one example, but it's a very important example, because what Don Lemon and others were trying to do was to intimidate into silence those in the church. That's what the left wants to do. We've seen this latent hostility toward religious freedom in this country. Now it's become blatant hostility. And I would argue, Steve, that this is a manifestation of the left's hatred toward God and any moral standard of right and wrong. What we're seeing is the fruit of what has been planted in classrooms over the last 4 decades. It's now bearing fruit, and it's not pretty fruit. It's rotten.
Yeah, Tony, we've heard the viewpoint that these protesters could have made the same exact point that they were making outside on the sidewalk. Everybody would have seen it. So I guess the question would be, what precedent does it set if they are allowed to go in there without any repercussions? And you do have federal authorities that are now proactively investigating these protesters. Yeah. So I guess when political activism enters sacred spaces, where does society need to draw the line between protest and protecting religious tradition?
Great question, Steve. I also served as a police officer. I spent 10 years as a police officer protecting the right of demonstrators to demonstrate in the proper spaces. But you don't have the right to go onto private property and disrupt a worship service. And as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, we didn't deal with domestic issues. We looked at issues abroad as it pertained to the freedom of worship. And this would be something that we would have looked at, where if a government turns a blind eye, now the government obviously is not the perpetrator here, but many countries, Nigeria being one of them, India being another, that allows the intimidation and even outright persecution, and even going further, the murder and massacre of Christians, the government's held liable just by allowing it to occur. So the government has an obligation here to enforce the law, to uphold it, to ensure that those who are gathering together to worship are not made targets by the left trying to disrupt their worship service. It's a clear violation of the law. I'm happy to see that the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, is looking into pursuing charges against those individuals.
Tony, today you were back in your home state of Louisiana, where you attended oral arguments in a case about your state, Louisiana's statute requiring classrooms to display the Ten Commandments. Talk to us about why you believe this is about honoring religious heritage and strengthening shared civic values rather than forcing religion on students.
Right. Steve, so we're in our 250th anniversary of the founding of America. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, the preamble, that's really our birth certificate. It talks about God, talks about a creator, talks about inalienable rights. You cannot separate America from the Christian faith. You just can't do it and not come up with the same America that the founders gave us. In fact, John Adams said that our government was made for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. There was a presupposition that we would govern ourselves. Self-government would be the foundation because civil government could never be big enough to enable us to have the freedoms we enjoy and maintain social order. So there was this idea that we would govern ourselves according to what? The Ten Commandments. They've been central to our form of government from the very beginning. And that was the point that my colleagues, former colleagues in the Louisiana legislature did when they enacted this law, saying that they will be posted in classrooms. You don't have to read them, don't have to cite them. They're just going to be posted in a classroom that is a reminder that they're fundamental to who we are as Americans.
Just a quick follow-up, Tony. Critics often argue that faith should be kept out of public spaces or public life altogether. What do we lose by taking this approach? And talk to us about the premise of separation of church and state that we often hear inserted into the argument.
Yeah, that's interesting. They want when they talk about separation of church and state, we always need to define those terms because we want the separation of church and state. We don't want the state and the church to merge. We don't want the state running the church, and we don't want this church running the state because both move out of their God-ordained roles and it leads to corruption and ineffectiveness. So what they're talking about is the separation of God from government, meaning truth from government, moral order from government. Can't have that. It won't work. And so the argument that the opponents were making today was that this violated the Establishment Clause because it required coercion. Well, to coerce somebody, it means you have to force them into some type of religious exercise, and there's a penalty for not doing it or a reward for doing it. How can passively posting a copy of the Ten Commandments on the wall of a classroom be a religious exercise? No one's forced to read it, don't have to look at it, it's just there. Some may look at it, hopefully they will. Maybe they'll ponder the meaning and why it's important to who we are as Americans. Because, Steve, if we lose that foundational understanding of who we are and what makes our system work, we'll no longer be the country. In fact, this is what the House Speaker Mike Johnson was saying this morning as he was speaking at the British Parliament, talking about we've got to return to that fundamental understanding of our beginning and who we are as a people. And we cannot reject that religious foundation that our nation was built upon. If we do, we do it to our own demise.
And just to take it one step further, perhaps as they are pondering it, if they decide to do, and as you said, hopefully they do, perhaps it'll prevent them from committing, a bad deed or a wrongdoing, which is good for society, right? Otherwise, what else is preventing moral decline?
What harm is done? What harm is done if you see a fifth grader read something that says, "Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal"?
Exactly.
Is that going to harm us, or is it going to make us a better society?
Tony Perkins, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.